Good afternoon to our viewers on Community Change Action, Facebook and YouTube pages. If you're joining us, I'm sure you're aware of the events happening in our country and all the questions that you may have about these events. And so we invite you into this conversation this afternoon around how we help to reimagine safety. I'm Dr. Seft Hunter, Director of Community Change Action's Black Freedom Collective, a growing network of organizations across the country committed to building both the power as well as the capacity of Black, Brown, and immigrant organization. Our organization, Community Change Action, believes that every family deserves to live in communities and places where they feel safe. And today I want to invite you into a conversation around these values. This is a critical question that is now facing our country. It is a multi-layered issue in which our guest this afternoon is going to help us unpack. And so with us today, I'm excited to introduce author, community organizer, and activist, Zach Norris. Zach is the executive director of the Eller Baker Center for Human Rights and the co-founder of Restore Oakland. He's also an author of a recent book, We Keep Us Safe, Building Safe, Secure, and Just and Inclusive Communities. Also joining us this afternoon is my friend, my colleague, Nana Jamfi, activist, movement attorney, executive director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration, or BAJI as it's commonly known, who's also part of our Community Change family and a colleague who works with our firm network, the Fair Immigration Reform Movement Network. Thank you both for joining this afternoon. And so for all of you who are also watching from wherever you're watching from around the country, whether in your car or at home, I invite you to just say hello by dropping your name and where you're joining from in the chat. And then also throughout this afternoon's conversation, we're also going to invite you to reflect on the question around when do you feel safe? So what are those conditions that help you feel safe? Please add your voices to this conversation and help to kind of contribute to this afternoon's live. And so without further delay, I want to just jump into the conversation with Nana and Zach. And so to start off, I invite each of you to reflect on the moment in which we're in right now in the country. And we've seen, for example, over the last several weeks and months, significant violence directed at Black bodies by police and white vigilantes. And in response to this, we've seen massive protests in almost every corner of the country and around the world. What does this signal to each of you, Zach and Nana?
Well, first, I just am really appreciative of the opportunity to speak with you both. Nana, I have long admired your work, and Seft, it's great to be a part of the Community Change family through the Black Freedom Collective. I want to just start by saying I'm here. I know there's a slogan in the movement that we are Black and breathing, and I'm aware of some of my own privileges in this moment. So I got my Eller Baker Center t-shirt on, and I'm acknowledging that I'm kind of closer to this high yellow color than I am to Eller Baker herself. And that's one of the privileges that I have in this moment. I also have employment. I have my family with me, and thankfully I have health. And so I go out to get groceries and to do protests because we need to be in these streets and we need to be letting folks know that we are no longer accepting of the status quo. And what is the status quo? In my mind, the status quo has been Black death in this country. It has been Black people dying of starvation, Black people dying because they don't have shelter to shelter in place, Black people dying at disproportionate rates due to COVID. And people who are just basically trying to survive, like George Floyd being killed by those who are supposed to serve and protect us. And that is a reality that is unacceptable and a reality that is being challenged in every corner of this country. And so I am inspired and grateful that there is this awakening that we're seeing across the country to really challenge historic and present systems of injustice.
Thank you, Zach. Nana?
Thank you so much. Thanks to Community Change, and thank you, Seft. I'm so excited to be here with Zach I've heard wonderful things about the work that you've been doing, and it's not often I get to be on a panel with a person who wrote the book on it. So I'm
Right.
really excited about that as well. You know, this moment for me is one in which we see, of course, challenges and opportunities. And really, my hope and the work that we're doing collectively is to build power to actually move the needle. I was here in Los Angeles, where I am now, in 1992. I was just getting out of law school. We ended up representing, in fact, one of the people who was accused of being a part of the rebellion at Florence and Normandy. And so I've been here before in my own real life, where you've had people be able to express very clearly and plainly their dissatisfaction with their condition and their refusal to continue to live in those conditions. And I've seen, where people have viewed and thought that all of these reforms were going to lead to the promised land, whether that be the police commissions, whether that be body cameras, whether that be, cops on bikes in Watts, California, going through the projects. LA has tried it all and has been the leader in a lot of these so-called police reforms. And what we know now, and what some of us knew then, is that abolition is the only way, that you cannot reform the devil, as I like to say, that, he had his chance and now he is in the mode that he's in. And these systems are designed to be how they are. There's no reforming based upon design. And so looking really forward to the work ahead and to the conversation we're about to have today about what does it really mean when we say we keep us safe. How do we do that? How do we push back? How do we build power? How do we abolish this criminal sanctions system and immigration detention system of caging and enforcement?
Yes, well, let's just get right into it. So, both of your organizations have a really long history of organizing on the issues of racial justice. And as you've both pointed out, the recent murders of unarmed Black people in Minnesota, Kentucky, Georgia, Florida, George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, Tony McDade, all these serve as really constant reminders of a system that just devalues Black lives, Black bodies, and Black humanity. We also see that some outside of our community are just coming to the realization that safety is not a common experience to all of us in America, right? And so how is your organization showing up in this moment? And how does this value of safety play in the actions that your organizations are taking right now? Let's start with Zach.
Right on. I am the executive director of the Ella Baker Center for Human Rights. We were founded by Van Jones and Diana Fapier in 1996. We're named after Ella Baker, who was a brilliant Black woman, a strategist with decades of struggle on her resume, fighting for freedom for all communities in this country. And we try to build on her legacy by fighting for books, not bars, jobs, not jails, healthcare and housing, not handcuffs. But one of the very first campaigns that animated our work was the murder of Aaron Williams. Now, when the San Francisco Chronicle heard about Aaron Williams on April 8th, 1996, they reported that he had died of what they called sudden in custody death syndrome. They described the officer who was there as a good officer who had this unfortunate thing happen on his watch. They didn't describe the 37 complaints against Mark Andaya. They didn't describe the 5 lawsuits against him. They didn't describe that Aaron Williams had been repeatedly kicked in the face by multiple officers and that 3 cans of pepper spray were unloaded onto his face. They didn't describe that he was left hogtied in the back of a police van where he died. And, with that information, the Ella Baker Center decided we were going to take on this campaign, organize, get folks involved, and begin to flip the script and really tell the truth about what happened. And over a period of years, really, we were able to challenge the narrative and get this officer fired Mark and I fired from the San Francisco Police Department. No videotape involved. Like, this was one of the very first campaigns of the Ella Baker Center. And since then, as I said, we've tried to expand our vision of what's possible. And I think we've been moved as an organization, quite frankly, in this moment, and led by Black abolitionists like Angela Davis, among others, who have for decades really been calling for a reimagining of community safety. And so what we've seen is that there is an opportunity in this moment to really ensure that we have public health solutions for public health issues. Too often, school discipline, mental health, drug use and abuse, homelessness are dealt with criminalization, and our communities, Black and brown communities, are hurt first and worst by that punishment dragnet that has come to replace any semblance of a social safety net. And so we describe the need to actually move resources towards books, not bars, towards jobs, not jails, towards housing and healthcare, not handcuffs. And that's been the work of our organization for some 25 years. And we're just starting really to see some of the seeds of that work bear fruit in terms of real community safety solutions that are driven by community members and for community members in terms of what we mean by community safety. So I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Zach.
You know, Ella Baker, the Ella Baker Center is one of our allies, one of our partners, I will say, in a lot of the work that we do. And that's why it's just so, again, fabulous to be here with Zach having this conversation. It also means I don't have to say much because he got it. With respect to what Baji has been doing, really, Baji has been building for this. You know, Baji started in 2006, was started by African-American, multi-generational African-American civil and human rights folks from the Caribbean who have been fighting around issues of brutality, militarization in the Caribbean, as well as folks from the continent, in particular, folks from South Africa who had lived through the apartheid regime and lived through the militarization and brutalization by police and security forces there. So from the very beginning, Baji has been an organization that has been focused on not just policing in terms of local police, but dealing with federal, with respect to ICE and Customs and Border Patrol, as well as dealing internationally with respect to the United States war machine on this issue of how we end caging, enforcement, violence against Black people. In particular, in all of its forms, but in particular, when we're talking about this physical violence that, as Fela Kuti, the great philosopher, says, they're bringing of sorrow, tears, and blood. And so in this moment, we are deepening and we are expanding the work that we've been doing, the work of researching, studying, getting deep into abolition, including the works of Angela Davis, of Ruthie Gilmore, of Mariam Kaba, right? And Andrea Ritchie and others who have really given us so much material and continue to give us so much material to work with to have this continual learning. We have, from the local level to the national level, been pushing back against having more enforcement, against having more money go into walls and go into body cameras, go into surveillance, go into training, all of these things that give these systems the opportunity to grow, right? And so, yes, we talk about defunding the police, but the ultimate goal is for us to have no police, for there to be no enforcers, for there to be no cages. And that doesn't happen unless we intentionally move forward in our advocacy at the policy level with respect to shutting those things down and completely defunding them, as well as dismantling their systems. And we've also been doing that work and connecting that work of what happens in the streets with the enforcers, with the cages, and why we need to shut down jails, and why we need to not build any more jails and prisons, and why we need to end contracts and dismantle detention centers. this is the work that we've been doing for at least the past 14 years. I tease folks where we started in 2006 as a nonprofit, but like most good Black immigrants, our official papers don't necessarily name our actual birth dates, right? We were working before 2006, and we continue to work in this, as we're moving. But one last piece, I think it's important in this moment for us to resist being ahistorical in our thinking, and for us to resist being excited about performances, right? About performative resolutions of these really critical issues, because this is a difficult conversation. And if you can move somewhere that can make you feel, okay, this I can deal with, that's what we want to do. And we want to push back against that. If you feel comfortable, you're not pushing hard enough.
So let's build on that. So Zach, you wrote a book, right?
Yeah.
So you obviously have been thinking about this issue, and I want to create a space right now for you to talk about the book and the prescriptions and ideas that you put forward in the book that actually speaks to this moment around possible paths that we could take going forward.
Right on. I want to start by saying this is not an overnight flip the switch kind of situation. But when we talk about the need to entirely transform our safety systems, we are dead serious about that, because it has been a matter of life and death for our communities. And I want to sit with what Nana was just saying, and ask that you be uncomfortable with us, because this nation was founded by white settlers who had the motto that the only good Indian is a dead Indian, and perpetuated genocide across the entire country. And I think we like to think that that history is long in the past. But I was born in the late 1970s, when folks were talking about the need for limited government and shrinking government down to the draining it in a bathtub. And I think that their motto at that time should have actually been that the only good government is a death government, a government that rules through the threat of fear, punishment, and death. Because each recession that we've seen from the 1970s, we have seen continued cuts to healthcare, to human services, to employment, to the social safety net, and never seen any cuts to prisons, policing, the very things that accelerate the mortality and the morbidity of Black and brown people in this country. And so that is the backdrop and the framework that doesn't just impact people of color, by the way, it impacts all of us. And I think we're seeing that with this president. I titled the book, We Keep Us Safe, inspired by social movements who were demanding a change in terms of the way we build our safety systems, and rejecting the lie of Donald Trump. And I call his lie the "he keeps us safe" lie. It is the lie of dictators. It is the lie of those who would hide the real harms that are institutional and interpersonal all around us, while scapegoating communities. And that's really what abusers do, right? They say, to the persons they are abusing, don't trust your neighbor, don't trust your mother, don't trust your girlfriend, only trust me. Meanwhile, they are the ones who are actually causing the harm. And the criminal court system has reinforced those harms by focusing on crime in the streets rather than focusing on crime in the suites, crime on the corners rather than crime in the corner offices. And that dynamic has led to the fact that they'll just give away trillions of dollars to corporations in the middle of a global pandemic. So I want to start with just being a little bit stark and asking folks to engage in that discomfort. But I do want to say that there's a path forward, that there is actually a path forward, just as we declared that we needed to divest from fossil fuels, that we needed an entirely new energy infrastructure, and began to really reckon with climate change, not as much as we should, but we've certainly set an intention that we need to move away from fossil fuels. So we need to now set an intention for an entirely new community safety infrastructure as well. And so what are the wind turbines and what are the solar panels that we need to be able to picture and imagine as we imagine a new community safety infrastructure? I think we need to think about initiatives like Devon Bogan's work at Advanced Peace, where they've helped to bring down homicides by drastic drastic measures without using a law enforcement approach. Think about, initiatives like Restore Oakland that we've helped develop here in the Bay Area that are grounded in restorative justice, economic opportunity, and the things that actually make communities safe. So it won't be an overnight switch, and we will need to be able to point to the kinds of community safety infrastructure projects that we need. But I think if we set the intention that we can actually move over time to a different reality that protects the safety of each and every one of us.
So Zach, let's not move so quickly from this.
Yeah.
Obviously, you pointed out that these are not pie in the sky ideas, right?
Yeah.
And I know that you've been doing some work with Alameda County Sheriff's Office and a local community college. So provide just a practical example of what this actually looks like on the ground right there in your home community.
Right on. I want to shout out Ruben, who is in the chat, who among a lot of other community-based organizations helped contribute to this Who Pays report. Who Pays the True Cost of Incarceration on Families really showed that not just individuals, but entire families are impacted by the criminal court system. But it also was a community-driven research project, and people were saying, we need restorative justice, we need economic opportunity. And we were bringing that message right to our elected officials. We were doing civil disobedience at their meetings, and we were demanding that they move resources away from the sheriff and probation department and towards community-based reentry supports, is how they framed it. But that was better than giving the money to the sheriff and probation department. And so we were successful in moving $10 million starting in 2015, 2016, away from the sheriff and probation department and towards community-based support. So people who had been through the jail system being able to be supported by community-based organizations rather than going through the traditional criminal court system. That was a huge first step, Seft. It was a huge first step because it was a signal shift in moving those resources. But quite frankly, we were underwhelmed with how those resources were spent. And so we said, everybody needs visual aids. Let's provide Alameda County, our county here in the Bay Area, with a visual aid of what we actually mean by community safety. And that's where that Who Pays report came in, where we're reading back through the pages and the transcripts and the interviews and saying that, folks believe that good housing makes them safe, and restorative and transformative justice make them safe, and economic opportunity make them safe. And so we try to bring all of those things into an 18,000 square foot building that we've called Restore Oakland. It has a dedicated space for restorative justice. It has a restaurant that will be run by formerly incarcerated folks and others who have been locked out of opportunity. Cause a Justa Just Cause is running work to help keep people in their homes. Rock United is running that restaurant that I just described. And so all of those things, I think, are very visual and tangible examples of what we need, because we know the prison system has come to dominate the public imagination in terms of what safety is. And so we're going to have to actually provide some visual aids and invest in the solutions that have been all around us, but have been underfunded and under-resourced.
So all of these tangible ideas that Zach just lifted up can be found in the chat, including a link to the book, as well as a link to his organization's website. So Nana, we know that this is a multi-layered conversation, and we know that the work that you've been doing through Baji is actually directly connected to this. So we know that African-American and Black immigrant communities are not the only communities that are impacted by policing, but we know that we are disproportionately impacted. And it's not just violence that happens in communities, but it's also violence that happens from the federal systems as well, right? And so we know that the fight against structural racism is real. And it's a huge undertaking that we know that must be done through broad coalition. So I want to just create some space for you to tell us about the work that you're doing with Baji and how is it connected to the fight, as you pointed out, for the kind of abolition of these systems, not just reform.
So the work that we've been doing at Baji, again, it is consistent, and we're really just working now on the deepening and expanding of that work, includes the work of fighting for racial, social, and economic justice with multi-generational African Americans. And I'm tending now sometimes to describe my siblings as the OG naturalized and birthright citizens, right? And I have that, I phrase it that way because I think it's important for us to remember as immigrants and as African Americans that the citizenship of non-white people in this country comes to us through blood, sweat, and tears, right? Through the Civil War and the efforts, the sacrifices of African Americans in that war could not have been won without us, and would not have happened without our agitations, insurrections, rebellions, etc. And that out of that came not just the 13th Amendment, but the 14th Amendment, which is where this citizenship for African Americans derives. And the enslaved and free Africans who were in this country at that time, by virtue of the 14th Amendment, they and their children who were born here were given a promise about what they could do and what they were entitled to in the United States of America, which we commonly refer to as the American dream. And when we come here as immigrants, Black immigrants and other immigrants of color, our understanding is that that promise, which actually wasn't made to us, which actually was made to African Americans, right? Multi-generational African Americans, the original OG naturalized and birth citizenship folks, that we are going to partake in that promise, that promise also covers us, right? And we assert ourselves in this country with the understanding that we are entitled to that dream. And so as Black immigrants in particular, it is jarring for so many in our community when we come to this country where that is described as this place where you can, live your best life. You have the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not even justice, actual joy, right? And we know, if we don't know a lot about history, but we still know that it has been paid for with the blood and the sacrifice of our African American siblings. And so we expect when we get here to be able to enjoy that promise, not knowing that actually that promise has been a lie. That, often in the immigrant world, we talk about the sacrifices we've made. We're essential workers, how we are the ones that are making sure food is on the table, that we've gone to the wars. We have not done a smidgen of what multi-generational African Americans have done. And the legacy that has been provided to this country in, physical labor, in bloodshed in war, in intellectual property, in cultural contribution. We haven't done a smidgen. And we see the ways in which anti-Blackness continues to be equated with some form of in non-humanness, right? Some form of second class and third class citizenry. And so as Black immigrants, we recognize, and as Baji, that it's really important that we also address the racial justice issues that are happening in this country right now. We cannot just talk about children and families being separated by immigration law, by detention centers, children in cages, and not talk about what's happening with Black immigrant and citizen folks with respect to this criminal sanctions piece, whether it be the federal prisons, whether it be local jails, whether it be state prisons, detention centers for juveniles. All of this is the same system of inhumanity that is born in the chattel enslavement that is this country's greatest and continuing sin. And so when we look at the federal level, the work that Baji has done is not just about, even though it includes work to divest from the immigration, detention, and deportation machine and invest instead in creating a more welcoming, accepting, useful, helpful, relief providing immigration system, but to look at the federal laws such as the 94 and 96 crime bills and to push for those to be rescinded, to look at how we can close down the federal prisons, to make the call to free them all. And the free them all, the original free them all, which talks about Black political prisoners like Ruchell McGee, Batula Shakur, and others that have been in prison on our behalf for our cause for 30 years, most of it in solitary confinement. So we are pressing on the federal level, on the criminal sanction side, pressing on the federal level, on the immigration sanction side, and then on the local end, pointing out and showing our communities how we have so many common fights between us or against us, let's say, that we must engage in, that we should stop the fights between us and really look at how we can, each with our own investment, each with our own consequences, each with our own understandings of, how we connect to this work, push forward towards the humanity. When we say until Black people are free, no one is free, we mean it. And so the work that we do to free ourselves from criminalization, from chattel enslavement, from plantation capitalism, from the detention and deportation system is the work of freeing each and every one of us.
Well, y'all see why we have Nana on this panel.
That's right.
Nana, thank you so much for that. And one of the best things about this afternoon's conversation is that it's live. You get the opportunity to talk back. And so let's just spend a moment and really lift up one of the questions that came in through the chat. And so the question is, how can we also dismantle the private economic interests that profit from criminalization of our communities at a time that we talk about public enforcement structures? So how can we impact the economic folks who are profiting from our marginalization? Let's start with Zach.
I come from a state where the private prison industry has not had as much impact. The California Prison Guard Union has done a good job of actually keeping out private industry in California for the most part. And so I believe that it is both a public and private question, and that we have to challenge the mindset in our government that this is the path to safety. I think Seth started with a question of asking our audience members a time when they felt safe, right? And so if I reflect on that question, I think about a time when my grandmother was holding my hands, and she had this way of holding my hands with two hands and just kind of patting my hand with one hand as she held my hand with the other. And it was just this gentle reminder that she had my back, but not in a simplistic way. She also had my back and would let me know if I did something wrong. And that's really what safety is really about. It's about being in relationship. It's about being held accountable, but still held in community when you've erred. And our public safety systems are the exact contrary of that, right? So when we remove people and put them in cages far away from their own communities, we aren't producing accountability. We are actually severing ties and severing relationships. And so we are severing the real possibility of expanding safety. Because what happens when, for eons and generations, indigenous peoples around the world held restorative circles, they held those circles with the person who's caused harm and the person who's been harmed, and a community surrounded them and created a plan so that they could be held accountable. And that is really a democratic process. And what I see happening in this moment is that this criminal punishment dragnet has really allowed for the rise of a fascist named Donald Trump, who has really leveraged that same system that has demonized and scapegoated our communities to a different end and to a different level that really threatens the semblance of the democracy that we had in the first place. And so that is something that I would ask people to really think about. as this is tactical and we have to make campaigns, but we also have to think about the kind of broader impacts of criminalization on our democracy itself.
If I can just add to that, and I would echo what Zach has said, and using California again as an example, people got super excited, and I try not to let my sarcasm come through my voice. Let me say this differently. People were very excited about the fact that California was no longer contracting with private jails, right? Private companies. And the headline was California, abolishes private prisons. That's not what happened. What happened is that California passed a law that said if you have a private institution and if you're going to staff it with private employees, right, of that company, then after 2020, California is no longer going to have a contract with you for prisons, state prisons. However, if you have California employees, in other words, if California guards are the ones who are working at the private jail, then it's okay, right? So it set up this dichotomy that I hear often and comes out of this idea of the private versus the public that makes it seem as if public cages are somehow nicer, kinder, gentler cages than the private cages. They're all cages, right? The cages they talk about in the Netherlands that are supposed to be so lovely because you have a refrigerator and all of that, it's still a cage. You still are not allowed to get out. People are sitting in their apartments and homes, if you are housed, complaining about having to be inside for 2 months with COVID-19, and it ain't nothing. When they were calling it a lockdown, I was like, this is not a lockdown. You don't know what lockdown is. But this feels like a lockdown to so many people. And if this feels like a lockdown, when you're in a place that if you are housed, that you are choosing to be in, and if you're in that position, because everybody is not, but if you're in that position, then it should be, and you feel uncomfortable and unhappy, then you can only imagine what folks are feeling in cages, private and public. But to the degree that we can push back against the private, of course we push back. We want to knock all the bricks off this wall. So if we can knock off private bricks, we knock them off, but not to leave public bricks in their stand. Instead, we need to leave the kinds of systems based upon the values and the relationships that Zach has just outlined.
Yeah, that is absolutely right. And we did ask folks to kind of reflect on this question of safety and when and where did they feel safe. And Lady Appleberry answered the call, and she said, when I can speak out without fear for my life, when I can speak out with a kind of passion that comes through without fearing that my life will end as a result of it. So that is the condition where she feels safe. Nana, I want to invite you to reflect on that question. When do you feel safe? I know, Zach, you shared in your last answer, but Nana, I want to extend the same invitation to you.
So I feel the safest when I am home in Ghana. And I can remember in particular a time when I was about, probably same age, like around 11 or 12, being in Ghana. I had just, it was our summer right after we had come back to the United States, and the school that I went to, which I'll leave its name off, but it was all white, all girl, conservative school. I went to school with John McCain's kids and Edwin Meese's kids, and it gives you an idea. And, I go to the restroom and people would have written on the wall, the South will rise again. And I was literally accosted by other students because they were upset that maybe I had done well on something or been recognized in some way. And I remember one day being at home, sitting again with grandma, grandmas are important, and thinking to myself, this is it. This is where I get to be my full self and just loved and appreciated. And I can feel like I'm not about to be attacked. I don't have to look over my shoulder. And so when I feel that feeling again, and I have, it has generally been in Black spaces where there has been intentionality about creating that sense of safety. When I've, shared or had a sense of shared values, where I've had a sense of shared relationship and deep relationship where I've had a sense of deep trust. And, and so those are the things that I've come to understand are important for me to be able to feel safe.
Well, thank you, Nana. And, go ahead, Zach.
I was just going to ask to tell a story about what that looks like on the level of a city, in terms of like what it means when those who have been persecuted and marginalized are brought to the center of the conversations around safety. I'm thinking about the story of Richmond, California, around the turn of the century. And Richmond had one of the highest per capita murder rates in the country. The city council was up in arms. They declared a state of emergency. They're like, what are we going to do about this? And Devone Bogan came to the city of Richmond from Oakland, had run this mentoring program. And he said, I want to try this mentorship program for these young men who are believed to be responsible for the most of the homicides in the city of Richmond. And most of the city council was skeptical, like, wait, you want to do a mentorship program? But I think that the city council and officials had tried everything else in their minds. And so they gave Devone a shot. And what he did was bring these young men into one of the nicest city council offices overlooking all of the city of Richmond. And he said to them, everyone has been up in arms about this problem, yet no one has actually talked to you about what you believe the solutions are. And here are some of the things that I have to offer. I'm going to provide you with a monthly stipend. I'm going to provide you with mentorship opportunities and travel opportunities for you to be able to expand your horizons. And as these young men were involved in that program, over a 7-year period, the homicide rate in Richmond dropped by some 70%. Young men were in a different relationship with folks who they had once considered rivals, who they had gone on trips actually to the continent of Africa with and come back with a different understanding of themselves and their neighbors. And through that had an impact not just on those young men, but really on the entire city of Richmond, because now mothers and grandmothers were able to take their kids to the park without being afraid. Shopkeepers were keeping their stores open for longer. And it was a huge impact, and I think shows what can happen when we shift from a framework of fear, blame, scapegoating to a framework of actual community building, understanding who we are, where we're from, and what are some of the roots, quite frankly, of the kind of fratricidal violence that we experience in communities of color, given the history of this country. And so I think that to me is an example that I hope everyone can get behind in terms of really understanding that these kinds of shifts are possible.
And so we could spend like another hour with these two, but we simply don't have it. And so I want to just acknowledge the brilliance, the real powerful voice of Zach Norris and Nana Jamfi, who's been, my colleagues, my guests this afternoon. And again, thanks to all of you at home, or if you're in your car, for watching us and share your comments this afternoon. We're organizers. There is always an ask. And so our ask this afternoon is that after this live ends, that you share the link with your friends and your family and continue the discussion. The content is stored on our social media site for Community Change Action. We're on Instagram, we're on Twitter, we're on YouTube. And again, thanks to all of you. Thanks to my guests, Zach Norris and Nana Jamfi. I'm Dr. Seft Hunter, Director of the Black Freedom Collective here at Community Change Action. If it's not clear from this, we believe that a better, more just, more inclusive world is absolutely possible. And that is our commitment as organizers, as activists, and as movement leaders. That is our fight. That is absolutely our fight. And again, I want to just thank Zach and Nana for joining us this afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.